So in preparing this panel, we asked ourselves a lot of questions, and here are a few that I hope will pique your interest. What does equity mean these days anyway? And we of course said anyway. What is the difference between equity and other measures of a just society? Diversity, inclusion, etc. How do we ensure when we say equity, we are making progress towards real, timely, and equitable outcomes? What stories and case studies can we lift up and be inspired by and draw lessons from? What is the report card on our equity work in the region? How do we continue to expand meaningful, early, and often engagement of communities who are impacted by disparities and systemic inequities? And are we ready for Equity 2.0? So joining us today, we have an excellent panel. I'd like to briefly introduce them all. At the top of each of their presentations, we've asked them to share a little bit more about their background, 2 or 3 highlights of the work that they're focusing on currently here in the region, and a listing of some of the activities that are coming up for them. We're really pleased to have Lisa Bates, who's an assistant professor at the Tulane School of Urban Studies and Planning at Portland State University. Lisa does her research related to housing, policy, and planning, and her work focuses primarily on social justice issues, including understanding how inequitable outcomes may arise from institutionalized racism in policy design and implementation. Dr. Bates has served as the co-lead for the Technical Advisory Group on Equity and Civic Engagement for the Portland Plan, and on the Creation Committee for the Office of Equity and Human Rights. She's also participated in the Partnership for Racial Equity, a working group convened by the Urban League of Portland to create a racial equity strategy guide for public agencies. Lisa's presentation will focus on moving our work beyond data collection. So please welcome Lisa. Next to Lisa is Desiree Williams-Raji, who holds the position of Equity Specialist at the City of Portland's Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Some fans, I see. She is co-chair of the Bureau's Diversity Committee and also a member of the Citywide Equity Committee, a member of the Public Involvement Advisory Committee, and also a member of the Office of Equity and Human Rights Creation Committee. Desiree has worked at various levels within the City of Portland, navigating and supporting institutional change, and she will talk about the need for and examples of institutional change. Please welcome Desiree. To her left and your right is Midge Purcell, Director of Advocacy and Public Policy for the Urban League of Portland, one of the state's oldest civil rights and social service organizations. Midge brings over 30 years of experience in communications, advocacy, and social justice organizing. In her current role at the Urban League of Portland, she heads the organization's work on advocacy and organizing, civic engagement, and social policy. She was the editorial director of the Urban League's State of Black Oregon report and coordinates their efforts to implement the report's policy recommendations on employment, education, health equity, child welfare, and criminal justice. Please welcome Midge. And at the end, we have Kalima Rose. She is the Senior Director and Director of Policy Link's Center for Infrastructure Equity and has the privilege of working with Angela Glover Blackwell. She currently is helping to direct their capacity building on social equity with 142 sustainable community grantees across the country, 80 regional and 52 local municipalities. This is the joint federal grant through EPA, the Department of Transportation, and the Housing and Urban Development agencies that seeks to advance equity at the regional and local level. So please welcome Kalima. So I'm going to sit down and I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful panel, and we're going to begin with Lisa. Dr. Bates.
Thanks so much. So I was asked to talk today about beyond data, which is a little hurtful to my heart because I love data. I served on the Greater Portland Pulse project. I see my colleague Antoinette Piatka from the Housing Bureau, who's my co-lead on housing. I've worked on data collection processes in New New Orleans and around Portland. And so beyond data, I actually once successfully convinced my entire undergraduate course in research methods that I had a tattoo on my body of the formula for standard deviation. So unlike Felisa this morning, I am not afraid of math. But I think it's important that, Felisa's comment, she's a little afraid of math, but she's not afraid to organize, and she's not afraid of social change. And I think it's important to recognize that we can organize for social change when it comes to our data and our data collection. So to jump to my total punchline, data are political. What we choose to ask about, what we choose to measure, how we collect data, how we report data, and the implications we derive from them are all political acts. And they all must be subject to our advocacy, particularly if we want to push our data analysis toward outcomes and goals for equity, right? So data by itself, they don't do that much, but data in the hands of advocates can be incredibly powerful. We can use data to underline a story about what's happening and make a case for changes. So it makes some distinctions there. I think we can tell a story about our experiences. We can use data to give voice. That is a really powerful combination of a lived and felt experience, particularly for marginalized communities, combined with evidence that can be heard by people for whom stories are not enough, right? And I think that the State of Black Oregon report put together by the Urban League is a wonderful example of this, where you hear the voices of individuals' experiences, and you see that underlined by quantitative data that show that this is not just anecdotal, this is not a single person's experience, but this is something that is structural, that is larger. We can also use data very powerfully as advocates to make a case for change, to diagnose the scale, the scope, and the critical outcomes and impacts of what we see as inequities in our community. Here I would lift up the Communities of Color report, Unsettling Profile, asking why are the overall outcomes of important factors for human success in the Portland area so mediocre? And they were clearly able to demonstrate that sector after sector, it is because we are failing people of color, failing our children of color. Right? The Equity Atlas that we see here brings that to a geographic scale. Right? This plays out in space in certain ways, and it points us to policy sectors that should be engaged in our equity work. Right? And so these can be part of ongoing advocacy efforts. They're strategies that really sharply bring our attention. I mean, it's difficult to think of a compendium of data that has been more powerful than the Communities of Color's Unsettling Profile in our conversation here in this region, something that people have held up and pointed to and said, this changed the way I viewed the place that we live in, right? And here's the political piece. It should also be used to point to who is responsible, what institutions, what policies are creating these disparities in outcomes, right? So one of the things that we learned, and Angela Glover-Blackwell mentioned this morning and emphasized this, is that aggregate performance data are always inadequate, right? So we must always, as equity advocates, demand that our program and policy outcomes be reported for specific groups, certainly specifically for racialized minority groups, as a particularly hard-hit segment of our community. And we need to push that disaggregation to the top of the page, right? Not bury it as an afterthought. That's how we infuse an equity strategy into all the work that we do, is to say it from jump, right? Not just, not just because it affirmed my experience, not just because it defines some kind of problem, but because it actually sets us on the path to the strategy that works. That the strategy cannot be to have a performance goal and an equity goal. The performance goal is the equity goal. That's how we push forward and move the dial on critical issues, right? And we need to have data that point the way, along the way from the start, from the initial definition of a problem through sort of the problem of performance, the design and implementation of our programs, right? So we want to make sure and insist and demand that our public institutions in particular are collecting and reporting data at the input stages and also along all stages of implementation and evaluation. So this morning, Angela Glover-Blackwell made an incredibly powerful case for why we need to talk about race. And I think it's equally important to talk about why we need to insist specifically on data on racial outcomes, on these quantitative measures that occur at all stages of policy and programming. And it is because the pernicious nature of the kind of racism that we deal with today, that racism without racists, it's inadvertent, it's unintentional, and it's embedded so deeply in our institutions that it's very difficult to see. So if we don't collect data along our stages about our policies, our procedures, our practices, and our everyday activities, right? Who's being served, who's not being served, who's experiencing negative outcomes, and who's experiencing no outcomes, no benefits, no nothing, we're not going to see it, right? Not because we're bad people, but because this is very ingrained in our institutions, right? So we need to get past those sort of embedded biases to drill down on those data points that can point us along the way, right? And we need to also make sure that we're making the right comparisons in our data. So I was listening the other day to OPB. They were having a conversation about the public schools discipline disparities. And it took a while to get to the point where I learned that yes, we agree there are racial disparities in our exclusionary discipline policies. And as it turns out, it's because there's this discretionary component of discipline, so-called willful disobedience, and that is where the disparities are greatest, right? And you know, with all due respect to the school officials who are presenting this information, they buried the lead, right? That's the point, is that there's a discretionary component to this policy and practice. Massive racial disparities exist there, and that is what needs to be targeted. And we can see that through data, and we can see that being improved by insisting upon data, right? So we have to connect these data collection to our advocacy. And to come back to where I started by saying that data are political, I think we demand things of our public institutions. We demand that they collect and report these data, and we have to demand that they're transparent about these data, right? Actually releasing the information. And we've, you know, certainly, I think many of us know that recently we've had some instances in which public institutions were not very interested in releasing their information about race. But we can't just ask for data to be collected, but that communities also need to organize to watchdog that data collection, right? To be engaged in that political process of knowledge production, that what we know about is what we've defined as the questions, as the key outcomes and impacts, the way that we measure them, and then collect that information. And that if we want that to reflect our reality, if we want that to reflect the reality of people who are usually marginalized in processes, we need to demand that this is an interactive and inclusive process for the collection, analysis, and interpretation of data, right? So communities and equity advocates need to take part in this political act of creating the information, the knowledge base from which we
I'm actually really nervous after what's been already spoken about. And it's funny, I've actually always wanted to be on a panel at the CLF Equity Summit, and now I'm kind of regretting that. But I'm here to talk about institutional change. And I have prepared notes, so I'm sorry, I'm going to be reading a little bit. An enemy of change is the myth of the simple solution. It doesn't exist. People want that magic wand. We heard somebody say this morning, if we had a magic wand that could change things, it just doesn't exist. It's, you know, like the diet pills on the infomercial. They're not actually going to create that change that you're looking for. Now, I actually purchased the Insanity DVD set, which is a 60-day program that is very painful and hurts, and you have to invest a lot of time in it, which is a little bit more accurate to the work on equity. It has great results, though, so that's important to note, that you have to put in that time and investment. So I think that's a great parallel to the work that we're doing. And the thing is, a little bit more on that, is that he talks about transformational change and to dig deeper. And that's what we have to do. We have to dig deeper. So I wanted to talk about 4 different aspects of change that are really important for us to know about, to encourage, and to support. The first is leadership. Leadership in institutional change can come from inside an organization, it can come from outside an organization, it can come from the bottom, it can come from the top. You don't know where that leadership is going to come from. The important thing is that it exists and that you listen to it. So thinking about the equity efforts that have happened in the city of Portland, I was thinking about where does that leadership come from? And Lisa actually mentioned, so the coalition, I think it was in 2009, was the State of Black Oregon report, and then following that in 2010 was the Coalition of Communities report that presented such stark data that Lisa talked about, and that was a representation of community leadership. That leadership articulated the imperative for change in a very clear way, and that is what our leadership needs to do. What was interesting from that is that the mayor heard that. Our leader, our city mayor, heard that imperative need for change, and he took that on as an issue. And so here we had community leaders that were advocating for this, and this is something that has not changed. Communities of color have been advocating for this for years. But on the flip side, the city finally heard it. The city took that as an issue that it wanted to take leadership on. And the mayor, to his credit, fulfilled that. He said, the Portland plan needs to have this equity framework, and it was supported in partnership by community. He decided that he wanted to have the Office of Equity. He took that leadership and continued to have that conversation. So for leadership, both current leadership and also whatever new leadership that we have going forward with equity efforts, it is imperative that that conversation continue, that they have the courage to talk about institutional racism, that they have the courage to talk about this in a way that matters to everybody. Exactly what Angela was talking about. This is not just about a people of color issue, it is about an issue that affects people of color, and it is about affecting disenfranchised people, and it is something that benefits the entire city. So having the courage, but also having the endurance is so important. This is not a conversation that once you say it, it goes away. So you have to keep at it. It's something that we can learn from the communities of color because they've done it for so long. So it's now time for the institutions to take on that role. So the second piece is acknowledge this issue, seek out the answers, rinse and repeat over and over and over again. This is a learning process, and you have to commit to that learning process. I think we have a hubris problem. We have this as an institution, and I can't totally speak for the grand institutions, but we want to be the best knowers. We want to have all of the answers. Committing to being a learning organization, committing to finding out those answers is actually acknowledging that you don't know everything, and that can be a hard thing for folks. But that really is a first step because that allows you to be humble enough to ask for the community wisdom, to say what does the experience, or how are people experiencing this in the community, and validating that and seeing that as something that has to be represented in the work that we do. So now I'm looking, I wasn't actually looking at my notes. So anyway, these partnerships are very crucial. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Portland Plan and the equity tag. So the Portland Plan, which is our strategic document for the city, started in, I think, 2009 or 10. I know there's some folks in the audience that can give me the right date. The Portland Plan started out with various technical action groups that were set up in various categories, and equity was a standalone category aside from everything else. Through the process of the Portland Plan, and because of the work of the people who were on the equity tag, the conversation of equity was elevated. So that now when you look at the Portland Plan, and I would encourage everyone to actually take a look at the Portland Plan because it's such an important document that gives us direction for equity in the city. we have a vision of where to go because of it. So the technical advisory group effectively was able to create this framework which now every component of the Portland plan fell within. It was the overarching, the cradle of this. So that changes equity from being the side issue to the issue which everything falls within. So that change of framework is so important, and it could not have been done without the partnerships of the people on the equity tag. So the point of this is that it's really just the beginning as well. The Portland plan set the starting point, but these conversations still have to continue. We have to look at that as a model, but we have to also know that we have more questions to be answered. So the third thing is clear vision and broad buy-in. So change happens when there's a clear vision for what better actually looks like, and that everyone understands that. And then the next thing is a plan for implementation and checks and balances. So change happens when there are systems and processes in place to hold us accountable to that change. So just like what Lisa was talking about with data, how do we collect that data? What is the system? What is the process? We have to implement and see how that works within the work that we do. So right now for the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, those are the next two challenges that we have. Because the Portland Plan set out that vision, which is something so great that we want to achieve, we now have the challenge of operationalizing that vision. What does that mean on the ground? How does the institution actually have to work differently? So my last point is that these things all work together, that they can't work in silos, they can't work alone. And one thing, if you have a great leader who's a visionary, but you don't have the partnerships, you don't have the processes or the systems, the change will not happen. And so it's important to know that the collaboration is an imperative as well. So I have other questions that I was going to respond to, but I'm going to go ahead and pass it on. I prefer to respond to questions and to speak openly, so I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you so much.
I remember that last year this time, I was sitting where you all were, and I'm recalling the conversation around equity at that time. And believe me, we have come a long way. We have come a long way in a year. At that time, we were grappling with what equity is and what it isn't. And I think that we have, in the course of that year, moved from defining what it is to begin to put it into action, or at least to put the building blocks together so we can put it into action. I think that sometimes we do lose sight sometimes of what we're talking about when we get lost in what I call the minutiae of the mechanisms of equity. And I was fascinated by Lisa's presentation around data. It's absolutely imperative. But we also lose sight about, when we're talking about equity, we are talking about our long-term vision for justice. And I think that our keynote speaker this morning really, really put it in those terms. The Urban League, my organization, was established in response to legal injustice. Black people couldn't live where they wanted to. They couldn't buy property. They went to segregated and inferior schools. They couldn't freely enter hotels and restaurants. They worked in the most menial and low-paying jobs. And they couldn't vote for people who made daily decisions about their lives. And I just give a historic example about the power of process, in that the Black community and their allies decided that the means of dismantling that legal discrimination was to introduce laws that enshrine the right and expectations that Black people would be treated as human beings, that they would have equal access to the same opportunities as everyone else living in this country, and They began that by struggling to pass the Civil Rights Act, the accommodation laws here in Oregon, and the Voter Rights Act. And those of us who were alive during that period of transformation, or for those of you who weren't, who are students of history, know that the process of transforming those laws that were the legacy of slavery, out of that a true transformation was born, the Civil Rights Movement. And that movement had at its core community organizing, leadership development, and empowerment. My organization, the Urban League, still refers to our organization as an empowerment movement. So I say that it was a movement that created a demand, developed leadership and strategy toward a specific goal and the expectations of justice. So equity is part of what I feel, what Martin Luther King called the arc of the moral universe that bends toward justice. It's not the goal. Equity is not the goal. It's one of the mechanisms to reach that goal. The goal is justice. And as Desiree intimated in her presentation, that equity just wasn't invented just this year. Everybody's talking about it, which is a great thing, but equity wasn't invented this year. People have been pushing on that arc for a really long time. It's important to remember that here in Portland, there were many, many community-led efforts in this city of folks that were working to dismantle institutional racism. An example that I'll give is Professor Karen Gibson's Bleeding Albina, where she talks about the city's relationship with the Albina community being characterized by extremes of neglect and active destruction. But she also talks about the resistance of the community who devised strategies to protect, preserve, and enhance their neighborhoods. The pace of gentrification made it a lot harder, but that resistance was there. There were similar struggles to improve the quality of education, to open opportunity for living wage jobs, to demand accountability from the police. I see there's some folks in here that have been part of that struggle. A police bureau that has used excessive force in our community with deadly effect. So those struggles, that resistance, have been going on for years. And for years, our community have been saying, this is our experience. We expect change and we expect justice. So, segue, fast forward to 2012. What's different? I think part of what's different is that we do have a new set of tools. CLF led with their Equity Atlas that began to visualize inequity in geographic terms. It was mentioned that the Urban League then produced the State of Black Oregon that was followed by the Coalition of Communities of Color and Settling Profiles. And these reports not only provided a narrative of the conditions of Black folks and communities of color, but they were data-driven. They showed disparities in every single social and economic measure, and that they provided an action plan that spoke to the needs of structural change to address the persistent inequities and institutional racism. And I think that you talk about the drivers of history. I mean, I think that those reports were part of a driver that was a tipping point, and we realized that here was a window of opportunity to make advancements in social justice. The report shone a light on the extent of inequities in this city, and it articulated a demand. And as one of my you know, kind of inspired historical figures. Frederick Douglass said, power conceives nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. I think the other thing that's different is opportunity, and one of the opportunities was the Portland plan. And again, Desiree talked about that opportunity to extract a commitment from the city to change. It was an opportunity to begin to change the culture of this city to ensure that the travesties of the past, like gentrification, never happen again. I think that the challenge before us is that the city doesn't know how to do it. And it doesn't know how to do a number of, the city doesn't have the capacity. And I think that part of the reason why we also advocated for the establishment of the Office of Equity is to develop that capacity. When the Urban League and some of our partners called initially for the Office of Equity, we called for the Office of Equity and Accountability. And as you may have noticed, the accountability part didn't quite make the cut. But if it's, whether it's in the title or not, accountability is not an option. But I think that in order to ensure that accountability, that communities have to be organized, they have to be visualized. The conversation has been a lot about internal processes, and being part of those internal processes, I don't know how many iterations of the definition of equity we went through in a 6-month period of time. I guess my message is for the communities that I represent, it's not only about linguistic science. I think that this work will only be sustained when the community is engaged and empowered and participate in the process of making their expectations clear. Our community knows what equity looks like. We know we don't have it, but we'll know it when we see it. It's about jobs. It's about being able to take your grandmother to the doctor and have reasonable confidence that the doctor will know that her cancer might manifest itself in a different place than the majority population. It's about housing and having the confidence that you'll be able to afford to stay in your neighborhood. It's about having a neighborhood where there's grocery stores where you can get healthy food. It's about good transportation that you can afford. You can to get to the job that or the job interview, should you have one. It's about making sure that you have the capital to open up a small business, or it's about the expectation that your kid goes to a school that prepares them for college and not for prison. So I'll stop talking in a minute, but I think that the other thing is different is that the demographics are different. I think that we're looking at the face of necessity to integrate equity in everything that we do. I think that the data that we present and the census data says that in 25 years' time, in 5 years' time, this city is not going to look like most of you in this room. It's going to look more like some of us on this panel. And if this city is going to prosper, if this city is going to be successful, that we have to invest in that population. I think that that's what's different. So I will stop there and take questions. But I mean, there's one other point that I want to make, is that I talked about what's different. I just want to say a word about what needs to be different. And I think that communities of color have articulated a demand, but I think that we really need to ensure that we have the political power to ensure that that demand is met. And I think that a lot of the betrayals of the past would not have happened if we had significantly more political power. And a central part of an equity strategy has to include organizing that power, to elected leadership and organizing the power of the vote. I'm sure I don't have to remind you that there's an election in a few weeks. And we need to know where the new mayor and the commissioner will stand on advancing this work that has already begun. I won't say that the work can be stopped. That horse has already left the barn. But it could be a lot harder and take a lot longer time. So we have a lot to do. What really resonated with me this morning when Angela Blackwell spoke is that we have to engage people who have skin in the game. And I think that that is the only insurance that an equity agenda will be successful in this city.
Good afternoon. I've had the privilege of working with many of you over the last decade through different projects at PolicyLink in partnership. And we just entered into a new project here that Angela was commenting on with Verde, NEA, and Hacienda CDC. And convening the work that we do for providing social equity technical assistance to 143 communities across the country who are trying to implement sustainability. I have some sort of broad reflections about what you're doing and how that relates to this endeavor across the rest of the country. And just as Angela was finishing her speech today, I had to step out and go take a phone call, and so I walked into the building next door so it would be quiet. And as I was sitting there, a woman came out of her office and she said, "Are you here for guidance counseling?" And she was in the psychology department. And I said, "You know, I think I might be." And so when they asked me if I could just give a reflection that would bridge between what Angela said this morning and what's going on here locally, what I've actually heard over the last few days of visits, that one of the biggest challenges here in Portland, despite the equity buzz, commitment, equity atlases, etc., is people's ability to talk about race. And that how deeply fearful that is for members of the white community to enter into, because it's unknown territory, it's fraught with conflict and terrible things in our past. And so I thought, well, maybe that's something I could contribute to in my comments, because I've worked at an organization dedicated to equity for 13 years as a white woman in its ranks. And so you are not alone in that challenge nationally. There's about 143 other communities that I know of that are engaged in this endeavor. And what they have done is put together new tables where the public sector is thinking about these issues, where they are trying to navigate what are meaningful and authentic community engagement processes, but where the leadership of those initiatives reflects the past majority demographic, trying to engage a new majority demographic conversation. And so everyone is on a learning curve in that conversation. And so, you know, I help Angela when she goes out and makes these speeches to prepare the framework of her remarks and facts and figures that she can rely on. And whenever I accompany her, there's no resemblance between what I gave her and what she says, although she feels well prepared by me, right? So I think to me that's just like emblematic. Like, she has knowledge and experience and reach and leadership that needs staffing and support and needs the resources of the agency that I can bring from the work that I do, but I don't have the same experience she does. And so by being able to bring my skill and expertise to her leadership, that is one really key tenet of being a white ally, a white leader, and bringing the resources of majority institutions to the equity conversation. Another thing I reflected on, like, she's so damn positive, right? Like, she and I went around and saw the same things over the last few days. I'm like, these people need a talking to. Like, you know, there's some stuff that has not changed in the last decade and in fact got worse. Like, one of the first projects we were working on was how to prevent displacement in the northeast part of Portland. And I am ashamed that we saw it coming and it has played out exactly as we saw it, and we did not prevent it. And when I go back and ask people a decade later what happened, how did we see it all coming, and it played out exactly like people predicted. And so one of the things I think was there was not institutional power commensurate with the need of the African American community to protect their interests in the Northeast. And so I think about, why is Angela Glover Blackwell so revered and respected? It's because she has an institution that has 100 staff members behind her that can make her effective in every single place that she goes out and operates in. So when I was asked to be on this panel, I was nervous. These are awesome women. I have learned from them. I highlight their leadership as some of the most effective leaders in the country on issues of advancing equity. And they don't have the institutional support and power in this community to live up to all the leadership potential they could bring. So, I think that I want to say, in alignment with Desiree's analogy, that it takes great muscle, heart, and brawn, and persistence to deliver on equity. And that is just as true for the white community as it is for communities of color. But we have a different role to play within that marathon. And so it is a continuous act of humility to make progress and learn how to be in a discussion about race and to be an authentic partner. You will be yelled at. You will be in a room where people will be angry because of their histories. And having humility and patience and thinking about deeply what resources you can bring to the conversation at hand is really your job as leaders in this community. Every one of you has resources and can bring leadership to the conversation, but it takes a deeply attuned listening ear to figure out how to translate what you hear. Then another role, Angela can be positive, and it's her learned experience that that's how people actually listen to you as an African American woman in this world, that people listen when you bring a constructive conversation. And when you show up and you're mad and you're deciding everything that's wrong, people are like, oh, you can't really work with her anyway, right? Okay, well, so when you are a white person in that conversation and you notice that there's only white people in the room talking about the challenges and problems in that community, then saying, you know, maybe we don't exactly have the right people in this conversation to be having this, to having it right now, right? So, or when offensive things are happening in a meeting, instead of expecting the one person of color that's at the table to be the one to say, gee, that was a little offensive, to be the one to say, maybe we want to think about and talk about that in a different way. And so we at PolicyLink call that the skunk in the room role. And I am proud of my white brothers and sisters when we can play that role. It makes us good allies. So I think with that, I am going to just close with saying, besides being allies and leaders on equity, and besides improving prosperity for all, and making our places and our outcomes, our regions, our communities more prosperous, it makes us more human. And I have been extremely grateful to be in the company of Angela these last 13 years and all of you in partnership, and I do feel more human from this work, so thank you for including me.
So thank you all. We have about 10 minutes, and we'd like to open it up to you, the audience, to offer brief question, brief comment. We have four mics over here on. Just this one over here, over by Irene. So if you have a question or comment, come on up, and we'd love to go ahead and get some of these out. And we'll try and facilitate getting a response or two from the panel. So please, Rex.
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for the panel. Rex Burkle, Metro Council. So guess what? I'm going to ask about regionalism. Midge, I saw you just yesterday. You were at Metro Council, and also I know you had help in terms of looking at the Portland Pulse and looking at the regional perspective. And one of the reasons we created the Coalition for a Livable Future 20 years ago was to take advantage of the fact that we have Metro, we have a regional perspective, and yet so many times I hear us talking always about the city, the city. And as you guys know, is that this is a regional issue even outside the boundaries of Metro. So I'm looking to you to think about, one, Lisa, on your work on the Greater Portland Pulse. How did we do? Are we doing the right things there in terms of addressing the issues of equity to the data that we're collecting? And then Midge, specifically, you know, the work that we're doing on trying to use this tool called Metro to address this on a regional level. Because again, the world has changed. The people of color do not live in Northeast Portland anymore, in my neighborhood. They're all over, and that's changing all the time. So that's what I'm looking for, is how do we get out of our box of the city of Portland needs to do everything, to let's look at the whole region, every government, which there are 200. But there are 25 cities, 3 counties that we should be working with. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the short answer on does the Greater Portland Pulse do it is no. I mean, it's data that sits on a table, on a map, you can look it up. It is not a conversation in and of itself, inherently. So it's how does it activate something? It's a conversation among people like who are in this room, who are thought leaders, who are knowledgeable about their communities, to understand our shared future, right? And see the interdependence that we have. And understand that as much as we love it here, and we've got livability and sustainability out the wazoo, there are a large number of people who are simply not experiencing that. And to share that across these perspectives and understand where things are going, and to think really carefully about what these changes that are coming mean. What do these demographic changes that are coming mean? What does it mean that we're in an economic recession, and where might we go? And how might we get there better together? And so I think there's a dialogue piece that's been really missing in the technical work of getting the data together, in the difficult thing about choosing indicators and how do you represent them and what's the colors on the map, that broader conversation gets lost. And I would also, from the perspective of inside the Greater Portland Pulse, it took a while before equity was a focal point of that project. So again, just like in the Portland plan, there was this learning that it cannot be on the side and then you try to shove it in, shoehorn it in later, but everything has to be addressed in the data from an equity lens to begin with, which it wasn't. And so it makes it even harder to have that conversation at a regional scale where you have got all kinds of different interests at play. I'm in the city of Portland. Think a lot about the city of Portland. I need to understand better what's happening in our outer jurisdictions, just as vice versa is also the case. So I think we could use a project like the Portland Pulse to start that conversation. It has to be very intentional, very deliberately done, and it has to allow for people to be living different experiences and to bring forward what they see, projecting forward into the future happening for their communities, so that we can start to understand how we're interdependent with one another, and that sometimes we don't actually really have the same interests, but that's okay too. Then move forward from there.
Well, I think Lisa answered it really thoroughly. Although I don't think it's a question of working in the city and not having a regional perspective. What I find particularly baffling is that entities don't seem to talk to each other. I mean, I think that you know, there are equity discussions happening in the city, happening in the county, in several counties, and happening in Portland Public Schools, PPS, and there doesn't seem to be a synergy in terms of people you know, talking to each other and developing a common strategy. That would be really novel and really welcome. I think that the other thing, I mean, looking at this, you know, kind of long term, is that none of the entities that we talked about are particularly representative. I think that we will ensure that equity is integrated within, on a regional level, on a city level, in Multnomah County, when people who are impacted by it are actually represented in those bodies. And you know, both from an elected leadership side, but also in who works there. You know, and I think that the more representative it is, I think the likelihood that we will be able to sustain the impetus for this work, and I think we have a considerable way to go before we're there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please. My name is Bob Wise. I'm with the firm Kogan Owens Kogan. We've been working for 30 years on public process and engagement in Oregon. And I wanted to get your candid views of what you see happening because of the role of new technology and availability of technology to communities we're discussing. I have this instinct, and maybe it's because we do work in rural areas, that there's a process of somewhat of disengagement that's taking place around the lack of availability of technology. I just wanted to see what your learning is and your instincts about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could make a little ding again to Metro. Opt-in? Ain't gonna do it. Right. Voluntary participation in online panel and sharing your opinions is not going to get at the issues of historically underrepresented groups of people. It's not gonna do it.
The biggest, the most effective thing after Katrina for communities of color finding their neighbors and getting organized around their property rights and the rebuilding of their communities was through text messaging. And so there's a whole body of research about who uses what kinds of technology and how people talk to their friends and neighbors, which is the very best way to build social movements and to both get information and to share information or to move initiatives forward. So I think really looking into the kinds of technology that are at play and building on those is critical. And then finally, I would just say that in the movements to look at infrastructure equity, and this is, I think, King County has done the best job of really looking at disparate access to different key infrastructures, that you will find that access to broadband and internet and those things, you would have, maybe there is a map, actually. I didn't get to look at all the maps yet, but there might be one about that. So I would say that could be a really good project for taking up of infrastructure equity.